Hey friends, welcome to Hoochhead Studio. My name is Robbie, and this week we're rolling with another concept that is tattooed on my arm because apparently my creativity only goes so far. I decided we're mounting the head of Jack Torrance from The Shining, but the frozen version, in honor of the winter season. Of course, we have a never-ending list of holiday-themed movies and characters we could have chosen to play with this December, but I like to march to the beat of my own drum, and that cross-eyed Jack Nicholson hedge-maze face is just pure gold. So we're sculpting and freezing the guy who booked his family what is possibly the worst winter getaway of all time. Tell me I'm wrong. Because who doesn't want to spend the holidays under 15 feet of snow with a hotel full of aggressively unfriendly ghosts while proving your father of the year by chasing your family around with an axe? To get Jack started, we slapped some clay onto an aluminum base and then used our little sketchbook doodle to get the proportions somewhere in the ballpark. Or at least, maybe in the parking lot of the ballpark. We then add a bit more clay to shape out Jack's chin and figure out his jawline, which also helps us plan out the neck. This time I'm skipping the weird long turkey neck style we used on the Frankenstein's monster and Bob Belcher heads, and instead decided it'd be fun to actually sculpt his shoulders onto the mount, so it's a little more like a bust but with caricatured proportions. So I added a couple shoulder-shaped chunks of clay and then made them into a little V shape because, well, it fits the round mount better than anything else I tried. I used a blade to taper the shoulders down a bit, hoping to give the vibe that he's leaning forward away from the mount, and then cleaned up that V shape that we just mentioned. After that, we go ahead and scratch in a couple lines to help future me remember what current me is planning for the shirt before we move on to start cutting out the shape of the face. I started with the eye line because Jack Nicholson has a pretty exaggerated brow, not too far off from Frankenstein's monster, and I don't know, it sounded like a good place to start. So I used a handful of tools to chip away at the face and lay out the brow as well as where the eyes will go and the cheeks. The basic idea is that we remove before we add because that starting blob of clay kind of looked like a thumb, so carving away is how we reveal a basic shape of the skull before adding the rest of the features. We keep working at it until it starts looking less like a finger and more like a face, and then smooth it out a bit before moving on to the nose. For the nose, we add a simple noodle of clay and smush it down before adding two little balls for the nostrils or cartilage or whatever the squishy part is called. After that, I add some more clay to start building up his classic crazy eyebrows before my attention span goes wild and we move on to the mouth for no particular reason. Throughout the tail end of the movie, Jack has this kind of feral underbite going on, so I start shaping out the mouth with that in mind, trying to portray that intense expression without making him look like a bulldog or a camel. With the mouth somewhat on track for how we want it, my attention span drifts back to the eyes, so I gouge out a couple of sockets and plop in some pre-baked white balls of clay. I then use a pencil to sketch in the irises before adding the lids to make sure I get that frozen, cross-eyed look just how I want it, because the stare is my favorite part. I know it's supposed to say, look, I'm frozen and dead, but honestly, it's just also a classic dad look, because this is definitely my usual expression as my kids run circles around me screaming 6-7 and screech singing Huntrix non-stop. Look, my kids are great, don't get me wrong, but man, I'm starting to understand why old people just park themselves on a bench or on a porch and stare into the void for entire afternoons. At least I haven't started writing 300 pages of the same sentence over and over again yet like old Jackie boy here, so I guess we're still all good. Anywho, now that the eyes are looking good and completely drained of hope, I'm ready to swing back to the mouth and add some teeth to push that underbite. I press a little rectangle of semi-transparent Sculpey into the mouth and poke at it until it sort of resembles a few chiclets rising up out of the lower jaw. After that, I start adding little bits of clay here and there to build up his lips. Squish the clay down and then blend it smooth and then shove a few different tools up his nose until I get his nostrils open enough to be believable. Next, it's just a lot of random poking and prodding at the face, adding little details here and there while I try to get it recognizable enough to actually pass as Jack. Then I slap a piece of plastic onto the clay so that we can carve some wrinkles and folds and other textures onto the face. The plastic helps us carve into the Sculpey without leaving any hard edges, so the lines look nice and clean and everything looks intentional, instead of looking like my hand slipped while sculpting. Next, I use a little wire tool to poke in some texture to suggest stubble before moving on to the shirt. Like I said before, we usually just add a long weird neck to connect it to the mouth, but this time I figured adding the shoulders and part of the shirt would be a fun little challenge and maybe make the whole thing look a little bit nicer. Plus, I'm planning to pile on a bunch of snow later, and the shoulders make a pretty decent landing pad to dump some of that snow. Once we add a little texture to the jacket, we're in a good place to throw him in for the first bake to harden the sculpt and lock in our progress, which will allow us to build on it further without damaging any of the details. Once it's baked and then cooled, we take him off the mount so we can get started with his hair. I decided to gamble a bit on this one and try something new with the hair by using some cosplay that I found on clearance at the art store. I've never used it before, but the voices in my head tell me it's a little bit more rubbery and flexible once baked, which will work perfectly for Jack's hair because it has a mess of loose strands around his ears that stick out off of his head. If I use Sculpey for hair like that, it's likely to crack and break, so I'm hoping the cosplay will hold up a little better. As I just said, I never used it before, but the cosplay is a lot softer than what I'm used to, so at first it felt more like sculpting with mud, which was a bit of a shock compared to the firm Sculpey that I normally use. So I spent a little time just kind of pushing it around and getting a feel for it until I got the hang of it enough to start building up the volume and adding loose hairs around his ears. After that, I carved some simple lines into the hair to give it direction, then used a small wire tool to scratch a bunch of tiny strands. Normally it's better to treat the hair as a shape instead of individual strands, but in this case I want texture for the snow to cling to. The snow will cover most of these details anyway, so hopefully it all works out. After baking again, it seems like the cosplay worked as I'd hoped, so that's a win. While the head cools, we're going to get started on the mount, and I've got bigger plans this time instead of just painting it black or white like we did in the other mounted head videos. This version of the character is frozen in a hedge maze, so we're doing just that with the mount, making it look like a frozen snowy hedge. We start by giving it a black base coat before putting our character back on the mount so we can trace out his outline, only to have it poop out a bit of hidden paint out of the hole we drilled for the armature wire, which is just fantastic. Anyway, we trace out the outline real quick so we know what areas to avoid, and then tape off the edges to keep them nice and clean, then add a nice coat of Mod Podge over the whole mount. To make the mount look like it's made out of leaves, we're going to cover it in leaves, which I know is just genius. So we sprinkle on a thick layer of material and then tap off the excess to leave us with a nice leafy hedge. Ain't that pretty? So the cosplay may have worked as intended, but the extra bake time was less friendly to the Sculpey and left us with this little crack. But no need to fear, I shoved a bit of liquid Sculpey into the crack and gave it another bake, which seems to have fixed the issue. And with the issue fixed, we're ready to paint, so I start by airbrushing on a flesh tone base coat and then add some bluish gray to push the frozen look. After that, I apply a few dark washes here and there to bring out the depth in the cracks and wrinkles. The wash settles into the recesses, and then I wipe most of it off the surface so the details stay dark and really start to pop. I repeat the wash process across the face and shirt to get all the darks in place. Because when I paint illustrations, this is usually where I start. I do shadows first and then lights. But when I sculpt, my brain just refuses. And I end up pushing midtones around for about an hour, wondering why it all looks flat, like I expect the depth to just magically appear. But we claim to learn something on every project, so maybe, big maybe, this one teaches me how to paint like someone who knows what they're doing. Next, I spent some time dabbing little bits of skin tone back on the face to make sure he looks frozen and not just gray. We do the same with the blood from his baseball bat wound by making it a cooler red instead of a bright warm red, so it looks dry and chilled instead of fresh. After that, we fill his mouth with some black to add more depth before adding some greenish, turquoise-ish hints around his cheeks, which should help as a transition from the pinkish skin to the darker frozen gray. Then we add some more pinks around his eyes, which may not make sense for the frozen look, but that's how his eyes look in the scene, so I guess we're sticking to the reference. I then add another round of darker wash to bring out the texture for the stubble and to add shadows at the jawline to help round out the face. Then we add a layer of slightly yellow tinted white to the teeth because I'm pretty sure excessive smoking and coffee drinking are requirements if you're going to be a crazy writer trapped in a haunted hotel. We tint the eyes a little as well so they're not so bright and full of life before we bring back the dead cross-eyed pupils, completing Jack Nicholson's classic expression. I mean, that's acting right there. After that, we tint the hair with a simple grayish brown coat before moving on to his clothes. And for the hair and the clothes, I'm pretty much just going for flat coverage because I intend to hide the bulk of it under snow anyway, so there's really no point in getting overly detailed with the paint jobs. Once that's done, we need to tone down the green on the mount so it doesn't fight with all the blues on the character. So we take the same bluish gray we airbrushed onto Jack earlier and mist a light coat over the leaves to cool him down. Then we squish Jack back onto the mount and make sure he still fits among the leaves, which he does, well enough. It's okay, because any gaps that may or may not exist will be covered with snow. At first, my idea was to slap on some Mod Podge and then sprinkle on this plasticky looking fake snow that I had in my desk for some odd reason, but it just wasn't cutting it. So I looked around the graveyard of junk in my studio and found a bag of finger cots and an old tub of spackling, and the clouds opened up and the angels sang because I thought I found the perfect solution. And it worked, it was fine. I thought the finger cot would help the spackling stick to Jack instead of sticking to me, but it still didn't want to cooperate as well as I'd hoped. So I struggled with it a bit until my smart little brain caught up enough to realize the spackling is just too thick and water would make it less thick. So I added water and thinned it out a bit and it worked a lot better. For the most part. I tried a few different tools to apply this new thin snow mixture and it kept sticking to them, but ultimately I decided a couple of sacrificial brushes would work best. And now that we finally got our snow mixture and application method mastered, all that was left to do was follow the reference from the movie and strategically cover this guy in snow and make him look good and frozen. And with that, Jack is done and frozen in the hedge maze forever. I don't know about you, but that looks like a holiday sculpt to me. Well, I reckon that's it for this one, so I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I hear the cool thing to do is like and subscribe to see what kind of nonsense we get into next time. And speaking of next time, I'm thinking of a little Christmas monster that's definitely gonna traumatize my children. Yeah, that sounds good. I'll see you then.